Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have a great webinar for you tonight on insect bite hypersensitivity. We are really excited to bring this webinar to you because we know so many horse owners suffer with these issues, and we're hoping that we can give you some information on what might be going on with your horse, how to get a proper diagnosis and treatment options. So tonight, our presenter is Dr. Susan White. She is the Josiah Meigs Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the Large Animal Medicine at the University of Georgia's College of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. White is a board certified in large animal internal medicine and also has a master's degree in veterinary pathology. She is a recipient of the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine Kirk Award for Professional Excellence and is a past president and chair of the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine. She has also received the Distinguished Life Membership Award from the American Association of Equine Practitioners, and she has a long-standing interest in equine dermatology, and she frequently presents topics in large animal dermatology at both nationally and international veterinary meetings. She also maintains a consulting service in equine dermatology nationally. And I can tell you, when our committee was putting this webinar together, and we want to thank committee member Tracy Estes, who did all the legwork to bring this webinar together. Over and over again, when we were searching for, who might be a great presenter, Dr. White's name just comes up over and over again. She's probably, it seems like she is like an internationally recognized authority in this subject. So we're super excited to bring her on board tonight and give out this information to you guys in a way that we hope will help your horses. So with all that said, we're going to begin here, and I want to also let you know that we want to hear your questions from the audience. So if you're logged in and you're listening, please use the question and answer box, or you can even raise your hand if you have a question, or you can use the direct chat box. We will get all of your questions fielded to Dr. White during the webinar. And if for some reason you have to jump off in the middle of the webinar, don't worry. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the FANA website as soon as we finish. So it'll probably be uploaded tomorrow. So with that, Dr. White, welcome, and we're so glad to have you tonight.
Thank you very much, Angie. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was just discussing with Angie her own horses. She's a resident of Georgia, as I am, and anyone in the Southeast is well acquainted with heat, humidity, and untold numbers of insects. Okay, I do want to extend my appreciation to the Friesian Horse Association for giving me the opportunity to visit with you this evening. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I feel your pain as I've had a horse with IBH myself. And we call insect bite hypersensitivity IBH. Veterinarians love acronyms. It shortens what you have to say. But what it is an acquired allergy. That means that this is something the horse develops after they're born, and it's to the salivary proteins, or proteins that are found within the saliva of biting insects. It's characterized by being recurrent. Many of its names contain the word summer because it waxes and wanes dependent on the insect population, which is dependent on the seasons of the year. If you live in an area such as South Florida and some areas in the Southwest, you never get away from the insect season, and it may be more continuous in those situations. The pruritus, or the sensation of itch, then leads the horse to scratch themselves in any number of ways. And this horse is a good example of how he scratched his face. He's kept in a pole corral similar to what's in the background, and you can see where he's rubbed up against the different parts of the fence that he's kept in, that he's bitten his legs, and he's shown a variety of clinical signs that he has been scratching. One of the things about the sensation of itch, and you may have experienced this personally with something like poison ivy and then being out in hot, humid, sunny weather, is that these conditions, heat, humidity, and solar radiation, enhance the sensation of pruritus. And it is the horse scratching themselves that leads to the clinical signs that you see on the horse. One, they excoriate their skin and hair. It can be extensive, the hair loss. And what's not talked about a lot is that when the skin is damaged by the horse scratching extensively, it's not unusual to have secondary skin infections occur on the damaged skin, which often goes unrecognized. The initial lesions of IBH, or insect bite, starts with erythema, which is a medical word for reddened skin, which in many horses, especially Friesians, is not often apparent because of the dark pigmented skin. They may develop wheals or hives. They may have papules that are illustrated on this horse, and these papules may or may not have a crust on top because the horse may be scratching the tops of the papules off like some of us do when we have mosquito bites. And if you look at this horse, you can see that there is little papules that are occurring all along on the neck of this horse. May be difficult to see. Gray horses don't tend to photograph very well, but they can be found in a wide variety of areas on a horse's body. Other horses may primarily just have what we call excoriations, where they've scratched off the hair, and then you get some oozing of serum and maybe some crusting. Here's another example of a horse who's done a pretty good job on her face as far as the pruritus. And if you look at her, you can get the idea she's rubbed her mane out too. With the fact that this is a recurrent, yearly, and in some worse conditions, year-round condition, the lesions become worse in time. And so if you start with mild signs of IBH and you don't do anything to try and control the horse's reaction to those salivary proteins, the skin lesions progress and become much worse. So in chronic conditions, you'll see hyperkeratosis, which is a medical term for thickened skin, particularly the epidermis. Lichenification, which just means folded like an accordion that you can see occurring on the neck of this horse, and depigmentation. And depigmentation is not a hallmark sign of IBH. It's a sign of chronic inflammation. And you can see, you may have experienced horses that have white hairs where they had a previous wound or a saddle rub or something, and it's just a sign that inflammation has been occurring over a long period of time, and as a result, they lose their pigmentation. So this poor guy here is a 14-year-old gray gelding who has obviously chronic IBH that was never given any attention for many years. I call him my poster child of the absolute worst that you can expect to have result. And this is more than ugly. It's disfigured the horse, but it's also made the horse unavailable. You cannot put a saddle comfortably on this horse. And so you can lose the usefulness of a horse from chronic skin irritations. So the question is, what is allergy? If you go and you look even in Webster's dictionary, it's going to tell you that it's an immune response that's damaging to the body, to a substance to which it has a intense reaction. We call it hypersensitivity. It's oversensitive to an allergen, and the resulting reaction then causes damage to the body. If you think about it in your own terms, we're all very familiar with hay fever, exhibited by this man who's sneezing, and you may be coughing, you may have eyes running, you may be stuffed up. And then there's asthma, which is an allergy that affects the lung, which happens to be a worse condition because the lung, if it reacts really strongly, can result in an inadequate supply of oxygen to the body, and people have been known to die from asthma. And so you're looking at this continuum of how this abnormal, excessive immune response can cause damage. Now, if we think about the immune response, I'm going to make this, excuse me, as simply as I can. My apologies to any of the medical type people who are attending this webinar, is that normally the body has two arms to the immune response, labeled Th1 and Th2. And in the normal person, horse, dog, there's a balance between these two responses. This part of the immune response, the T helper 1 cell arm, generally deals with infectious agents that or foreign substances that have gotten within the cell. And so the immune system takes that damaged cell and kills it and gets rid of it so that that substance is no longer there. And we can think of that in today's time of the COVID virus. What you want when the COVID virus enters your cells and causes signs of disease is you want some action to get rid of that virus by getting rid of the infected cells. The other arm, our Th2, has to do with the development of antibodies, immunoglobulins, if you will. And we think of those in terms of COVID as if we have antibodies circulating that are against the COVID virus. Hopefully those antibodies are going to capture that virus before it has a chance to get into the cell and cause disease. And this is a very complicated process, which graduate students spend years learning everything that is currently known about. But in allergic individuals, what happens is that the balance between the two arms of the immune response gets skewed towards Th2. So there's a much stronger response and not the feedback by Th1 to try and keep this in balance. And basically, we end up with antibodies to the salivary proteins in the insects that are a specific type of antibody called IgE, which attaches to mast cells that reside in the skin. And there's a whole constellation of cell mediators that are released during this process that result in inflammation. These mediators also attract eosinophils, which is an inflammatory cells associated with IBH in the skin of the horse affected by IBH. If a pathologist looks at a sample of that skin, eosinophils are the hallmark of the inflammatory cells. And they in turn secrete cytokines that could make a big circle and keep this whole thing going in a cycle that perpetuates itself. So if we think then, who's the primary offender or what is the primary offender, who that carries these salivary proteins? And the primary offender is the Culicoides gnats. Here's an artist's drawing of one, and here's some Culicoides gnats compared to the tip of a pencil and a dime. They're often called midges or no-see-ums. And there's a whole bunch of Culicoides gnats. There's 300 or so different species of these gnats. I think there's about 89 different species that live in the United States. Not all of them are biting and thus a possible originator of IBH. But what I'm trying to say is there's many of them. We also know that the development of the hypersensitivity to these salivary proteins, or the bites of the Culicoides gnats, is influenced a number of ways. We've known for decades that there's a familial predisposition, meaning that certain lines or families of horses, when records are kept, have a higher incidence of development of IBH. In the last 15 years, there's been several scientific peer-reviewed papers that have shown that there's definitively a genetic predisposition. And unfortunately, this is a polymorphic genetic predisposition, meaning that it's a combination of aspects of many different genes that leads the immune response to that skewed towards the Th2. So we can't, or at least we don't have at this time, a genetic test that we could do, which is generally looking at point mutations in one and only one gene, and is therefore easier to develop a test for. Now, if we have a horse that has genetic predisposition, we know his family has had a high incidence of IBH, you will not see clinical signs unless you have the environmental influence, and that's the presence of the insects that are, by biting the horse, placing the allergen within the horse. And this is a slide I use a lot when I talk about IBH, and it's way over 20 years old. It's a clinical case that I had. These people bred Morgan horses. They originally lived in the West. They moved to Georgia. They owned the stallion, and they owned these two mares. And the stallion was phenotypically normal, had no signs of IBH. This mare was normal. This mare had slight signs of itching in the summer. And when these mares were bred to this stallion, here's their offspring, and every single one of them had rather marked IBH. And so I think you may be aware of this if you, maybe not in the Friesian horses, but quarter horse people know all about having a homozygous genetic makeup for abnormality versus a heterozygous. So it depends on the combination of the genetic influence. This is not a guarantee what every family would be like, but it's a pretty good example of how a family is highly affected by IBH. What I don't know is I don't know anything about the stallions that were used in those two mares, but I think the owners were somewhat cautious about continuing to breed these mares because these were hard horses to manage. So the classic clinical signs of IBH is a dorsal distribution where the mane is rubbed out, as you can see in this horse, and you can see there's the folding skin here that we call lichenification, and the loss of hair is exhibited especially in the lower part of the mane, and the pruritus around the tail head where the horse has rubbed all the hair out of the dorsal part of his hair. And the first papers that actually, scientific papers that occurred about hypersensitivity to Culicoides bites was back in the 1930s. So this is not a new disease. We do know now, because we have a better handle on the different species of Culicoides and where they may be distributed throughout the world, that there are Culicoides gnats that bite in any region on the horse except right in the flank area. So here's a horse exhibiting loss of hair, folding skin, signs of pruritus that is not had its mane affected. So it's not just a dorsal distribution, which is the classic sign. Another interesting paper that was published recently was scientific proof that there is a conservation of salivary proteins across different insect species. And what that means to you is that if your horse has IBH, chances are that horse is also allergic to bites of other insects. I affectionately refer to this as bugs that have teeth with wings. It can be a variety of them. I happen to personally be very, very sensitive to the bites of anything. So, this is kind of how I look at anything that flies and lands on me. Things bite me that don't bite other people. And here's an example of a horse, and I wish I had the whole horse in the picture that's behind her, because you could recognize, if you could see her forequarters, that one, she's bright and alert. Does this horse look happy? No, she doesn't. She has a really sort of aggravated, sad look. And she has a bit of a dilated nostril that goes with the pain face. She's got her ears flopped back. She's sweating all over, and you can see that she has signs of bites of insects all over her. And so here again, I'm just showing you that it can be a variety of insects, which just makes our control a little bit more difficult. And that it is individual, that you can have horses that are affected with IBH living with horses in the same condition that are not affected by IBH. So this is I usually use this as an introductory slide when I'm talking about pruritus, that bugs are important. I mean, even if you have a horse without a hypersensitivity to insects, one, they're terribly annoying. This horse is definitely annoyed. Many of them cause pain when they bite. The pruritus may not be sustained like it is in IBH cases. We already were talking about allergies. We can have secondary infections, and these biting insects can carry many other diseases. So who are we talking about? We've already talked about Culicoides. Cymulian flies, or black flies, or buffalo gnats. We'll talk about them in a minute. Stomoxys calcitrans, these are stable flies, and they are a big player in horses that have allergies to salivary proteins. This hematobia is the horn fly that reproduces in cattle manure, but they are capable of going pretty good distances and can end up on your horse. And then also mosquitoes. I'm going to have a few things to say about mosquitoes. We usually don't think about them in horses with IBH. We think about mosquitoes as the vector for West Nile virus and Eastern encephalitis. Now, what we're not going to talk about today are these horseflies, deer flies, mites, and ticks, but they can also be involved in allergies that may clinically present in the same way. So the black fly, Cymulian, or buffalo gnats, they have a predilection for the ears and face. And many of you, if you're looking in the inside of your horse's ears, may recognize little pinpoint hemorrhages where they bite, coalesced hemorrhages where there's been a lot of them. And very often they end up with some pigment changes and scarring or proliferations within the inside of the ear from repeated exposure to the black flies. And you can pretty much ignore this when they're very, very severe in super young animals or small animals. Think foals born of miniature horses in mass attacks. There is they can have really severe reactions to the totality of the salivary proteins and suffer systemic disease. Stable flies are a big problem. They are vicious biters. If you go to a barn that has stable flies and you're wearing shorts, you will know if they bite you on the leg because it's painful. They cause nodules, papules, and wheals like we see on this horse. And if you look at them very closely, I'm often advising veterinarians when they're dealing with dermatologic problems to have an inexpensive magnifying glass in their back pocket, like a plastic one you can get from Dollar General. And you can look at these stable fly bites and they have a little pinpoint crust right in the middle where their proboscis penetrated the skin. Stable flies prefer bright sunlight. So if there's a finite number of them, you'll see them affecting the horses when they're out in sunlight. If you have a barn that's heavily infested with them, they'll be everywhere in the barn. So this is not a hard and fast rule. Excuse me. The horn flies have classically been given as the cause of ventral midline dermatitis, which just means there's something wrong with the skin on the bottom of the horse's abdomen. And these are the flies that are reproduced in cow manure. When they find a host, they spend their entire life on that host until they deposit their eggs in cow manure. You can recognize them because they're about 50 or 60% the size of either a housefly or a stable fly, and they're in the shape of little triangles. And if there's a small number, they tend to sit on the horse with their heads pointed towards the ground. They like shade better than sun. And if there's a small number of them, they'll migrate down to the ventral part of the horse to be in the shade when they're turned out where it's sunny. If you put them in the barn, those flies will not necessarily be on the ventral midline. They'll be anywhere. And here's an example of a body of a horse that has a whole lot of horn flies on her thorax. And you can see that they're little triangles, these that are reflecting light. And not all of them are pointed down, but the majority of them are, and they can be a cause of IBH as well. This particular horse lived next to a large cattle farm that didn't do anything about controlling horn flies. And they just moved over to this particular farm that had horses and were quite a problem on that farm. So let's say a little bit about mosquitoes. Many horses, horses that live outside, they get more mosquito bites than we do because we tend to use insect repellent when we're outside. We're not outside all the time. And many of them don't have an apparent reaction to mosquitoes, but they can develop an allergy to mosquito bites. As it is illustrated in this thoroughbred mare that lived up until recently in Houston. And when Houston was having all the flooding last year, the mosquito population just became horrendous. And this is the result of the mosquito bites on this particular mare. And they were biting the horses, whether they were inside the barn or outside. The barn she lived in was a pole barn with open air stalls, which is absolutely necessary in South Texas because of the heat. So if you said, geez, is this stable flies that's doing this? If you have that handy dandy little inexpensive magnifying glass, they do not have a central crust. Now, why is this important? Why do we need to look and identify the types of insects that are affecting our horse? Because it's easier to positively affect the environment of horses that are being bitten and having the subsequent allergy if you can manage the environment to decrease the insect population. We know that stable flies, Culicoides, and some other insects, mosquitoes propagate in standing water or very wet areas. Stable flies, for example, they will lay their eggs in wet, moist mud or rotting vegetation, not just in manure. So when you look at environmental management, if you have areas of marshy areas or areas where water accumulates, or you have big Rubbermaid tubs for water that are out in the back 40 that doesn't get changed very often. These are areas that are available for breeding and increasing of the population. Certainly manure management and the bedding that goes with it. Manure should be composted properly, which is another whole subject and can easily find out by Googling manure management so that it gets hot and it does kill any eggs or larvae that may be deposited there. And then other ways of fly control are the use of fly predators. These are wasps that you release the larvae onto your property in areas where flies propagate. The wasps bore into the larvae of the flies and eat them so that you have no mature flies being produced. And these are very helpful in places like the Southeast where we have a lot of wet vegetation. You know, there's a lot of rain that occurs in many, many areas of the Southeast. And so by just managing manure, you cannot completely control Culicoides, mosquitoes, or stable flies. The other type of control of flies is to use feed-through fly medication that you put in the grain of the horses. And this is a reproduction inhibitor. It has an inhibition of chitin formation, which is the exoskeleton of insects. And this works very well in places such as the Southwest, where there's not a lot of green vegetation and in today's time, very little water that you're not supplying. But I don't think that they are as effective in situations like those of us who live in the Southeast. You'll walk into barns and you'll see all manner of fly traps that people use. And the one piece of information I would give you there is your fly traps really should be away from the horses, because a fly trap is designed to attract the flies and then in some manner destroy them. And if you hang them in your barn, the horses are attracting the flies and the fly traps are attracting the flies. And so you want to distance them a little bit from the horses themselves. So this is one of the two kinds of fly predator wasps that are available. This happens to be Spalding's product. And this is just to show you how tiny these wasps are. You get bags of the larvae every month. Here's a wasp sitting on a dime. They're very effective. Where they're not effective is if your farm is next to somebody who has a bad fly problem that they're not controlling. My farm at the moment, there are no cattle or horses that are now near me. And so I use fly predators and I have virtually no flies. I mean, people come to my barn and I always ask them, what's missing? You see people looking around, trying to think rapidly. And then I have to ask, do you see any flies? Can you count them? So that's something to keep in mind. Another way to avoid insects is through a turnout schedule that avoids the primary offender. So if you can identify, and your veterinarian can help you do this, that you have a stable fly problem or a Culicoides problem or a black fly problem as the majority of the offenders, then you can think about turning your horse out when they are least likely to be present. Another very effective method is to use the fans to move air in stables and in turnout sheds, run-in sheds, to keep the insects from landing on the horse. A few things to say about fans. Please do not use box fans that you use in your house that you buy at Walmart and Home Depot. These fans are very inexpensive, but they are not wired for outdoor use, and they are a big cause of barn fires. This fan right here, this is what I have in my barn. I bought these at the ones I use at Tractor Supply a number of years ago. They go on sale. They used to be $80. I'm sure they're a bit more expensive now. And they are designed for use in outdoor situations. It's mounted with an angle iron, and you want to be sure that you have an electrician that wires appropriately in an outdoor situation and not as you would for a house to, again, avoid barn fires. Protective clothing, fly sheets, face masks, leg guards. There's a plethora of these on the market, and you may find they are helpful or not. For your horse, some horses refuse to wear leg guards. Other horses are better known as Houdini when they get out of their fly sheets. But these are another avenue that you can use to protect your horse. And then in a little bit, I'm going to talk about fly repellents. So I said initially, let's turn the horse out when the insect pressure is not so great. Stable flies, we've talked about where they propagate. They like daylight. They like sun. Black flies are worst morning and evening, not at the height of the daytime. Culicoides, here again, standing water, manure, decaying vegetation, twilight to dawn, mostly at night. And then, of course, mosquitoes tend to be the worst at dusk and in the evenings. And you can look at this and you can say, well, gee whiz, if I have a horse that has IBH and they're allergic to the bites of more than one insect, I can't turn them out. And that's true. It's very hard in many areas of the country, ours in the Southeast, to find a time when there isn't going to be some insect pressure. However, if you have a horse, and I have an example of this at the end of the talk about a horse that was just allergic to stable fly bites, and so it's very easy to manage him. We have horses, if we know that mosquitoes are the primary offender, then we can manage those. And this is, I apologize for skipping around here. This is just an example of a face mask. This one has ears that are included in the face mask. I can't tell you the number of horses I see wearing face masks with no ear protection. And I'm hoping they're living somewhere where black flies and Cymulian flies are not existing. There's a wide variety of leg guards. Stable flies love the lower legs of horses. Horn flies also like the lower legs of horses. In many instances, horses with white legs tend to be more affected than horses with dark pigment. And then in today's time, there is a whole variety of fly sheets to protect your horse from insect bites. And my advice is buy the one that they wear. Some horses will wear a certain brand and they'll pull the other brands off. Long time ago, there was initially a horse blanket, and I think you can still get them on the market, that had insect repellent impregnated into the blanket itself, much like the human buzz off clothing. And I used to advise clients to buy those, and I don't anymore. They say that it lasts, 25 washings and all that. They don't last very long as far as the insect repellent properties. So I think any appropriate sheet would do. I put this in halfway for amusement for those of you who read the horse magazine. This was a big spread a year or two ago where they discovered in Africa that the tabanid flies, those are horse flies, not the kind we're usually dealing with, didn't land on zebras as much as they did on animals that didn't have this black and white stripe. And so it was shown in horses. Here again, we're talking about tabanids, not about stable flies, etc. But entrepreneurs quickly came on the market, and you can now buy a zebra striped fly sheet for your horse. I currently don't have anybody that I know personally that has one of these, so I can't speak to its effectiveness. So let's talk about things to put on the horse to keep the flies from landing. And truth of the matter is, most of the products on the market as fly repellents are really insecticides. And ideally, we would rather keep any insects from landing on the horse and not just killing it once it does land on the horse. And they come as sprays, they come as creams such as this, they come as concentrated spot-ons. These are all bought over the counter at a feed and tack store. And many of you probably have used some variety of these. And I tell people, you don't have to know anything about the active ingredients, and you don't have to even try and pronounce them. The important thing when you're looking at sprays is to take a look at the ingredients and add up the percentage of active ingredients. And I have trouble between my pointer and my slide advancer. So we have active ingredients here, and it lists and it says, okay, there's this much percentage of it, this much. And then you have below that, you have inert ingredients. The active ingredients should add to at least 2% of the total product. Otherwise, I think you're totally wasting your money. And if you go to your local tack and feed store and you start reading bottles, you will find that the least expensive product has the less active ingredient in it. And I don't know if it's cricket to say this, but Bronco has probably the least active ingredient of any of them you can find. Then there's the spot-ons, and I don't know how many of you have ever used these, but these are very concentrated, 38 to 60% of the active ingredient, and they're meant to work like Frontline does on your cat or your dog. You put so much of this substance on the tail head, along the mane, on the lower legs. The problem with this application is that there's a lot of horses that react adversely to it. And one of the first clinical signs is pruritus. And so you have a horse that may not have been scratching out its tail, but it is now because of the pruritus to the substance. And if the horse is in the sunlight, then the reaction is that much worse. These type of products, I think, are good when you're doing a small area, you know, like around a superficial wound or just on the ventral midline, rather than, obviously, you're not going to use squat on the whole horse. So permethrins are a synthetic product that is like the product found in a certain species of chrysanthemums, which is pyrethrins. And the permethrin, rather, the pyrethrin is inactivated by sunlight really rapidly. And one of the things about permethrins is they're not inactivated by sunlight as fast, and so they last longer. I think everybody's experienced that none of them last very long. And so you want to strategically decide when you're going to use these products. Some of them are based in oil, some of them are water-based. Personally, I'm not a fan of oil-based products because of my experience in the Southeast. Oil is a non-permeable barrier, and then you heat it up in the ambient temperature, you add sunlight to that, and you've created a hot, humid, and contaminated area under the oil, and you get a lot of skin reactions. So I'm more comfortable with water-based. Water-based doesn't last as long as oil does. The horse may sweat it off, etc. There's a whole variety of natural repellents that use different ingredients. And if you have found one that works well on your horse and doesn't cause skin reactions, then I think that's good. And there's no reason you shouldn't use it. Just remember that a horse that is predisposed to develop allergies, particularly an atopic one, which we'll get to, I hope time is racing by here, where there's skin barrier dysfunction and allergens can go through the skin, you'll see more reactions. Here's an example on the left of a horse that has a pretty good skin reaction to that spot on high concentrated solution. And here's a horse that's practically naked from a skin reaction to a spray on product. And I put these in there as examples of, just like they advise you with any of the skin products you use on yourself, test the horse before you repeatedly use it. Okay. How can you treat your horse? How can you make them feel better yourself without involving necessarily medicine or you have to have a veterinarian involved in some of this. One, keep them out of the severe solar radiation, heat and humidity. Use cool water hosing. I used to joke that my grooming equipment in the summer was a hoof pick and a water hose, and that cool water will decrease itch. If they're very dirty or very sweating, baths with a hydrating shampoo, one that has colloidal oatmeal. Tramoxin is a topical anesthetic, and maybe one with 1% of hydrocortisone. Here's an example of such a product. This is only available through a veterinarian. Here again, I caution you about overzealous bathing with any number of the 50 some odd horse shampoos that you can find. Many of them will denude the skin of its natural protective lipids and may make the horse susceptible to secondary infections or the skin itch even worse. There's also some leave-on hydrocortisone rinses that you can use after hosing or bathing. Your veterinarian may prescribe antihistamines. There's probably 6 different ones that have been used in the horse, and I've only listed the 2 that are most commonly used, and that's hydroxyzine and a cetirizine known as Zyrtec. And the one thing to think about when you study the allergic reaction in the skin, histamines are only responsible for about, and this is a generalization, 1/3 of the itch sensation. So 2/3 of the itch sensation is due to cytokines that are not affected by antihistamines. And so very often antihistamines are only partially or non-affected. And just like various antihistamines in humans, what works in one horse may not work in another. And so very often you and your veterinarian have to go through a trial and error period where you try different antihistamines and different doses to try and find one that is effective. I don't know how many of you people have used Trihist or have them in your medicine box at home. That antihistamine, pyrolemonine, and pyrolemonine, which is an H1 inhibitor, has a very poor bioavailability in horse and an extremely short half-life, and I think is probably not worth administering to the horse. So we already talked about using topical steroids. Triamcinolone is a more potent topical steroid, which you must get prescribed by a veterinarian, that is good for spot areas. I don't advise you put it all over the horse. The thing about hydrocortisone in very low concentration is if the skin is relatively intact, it is not absorbed. It's found in medications for babies with diaper rash, and you know that they're not getting a high dose of hydrocortisone if they in a product that you would put on a human neonate. Many of you may have used administration of either prednisone or prednisolone or dexamethasone, which you give orally to the horse. Steroids have many actions within the body. The most broadly known one is it is a potent immune suppressor, but it also has a whole bunch of other things that it does, which may be detrimental to the horse. And so I am not a proponent of long-term use of parenterally given steroids. What I like to think of when you're thinking about how am I going to treat and manage this horse, prevention and maintenance, that's all the things we've talked about. That's managing the environment, managing the insects, managing the turnout, proper use of insect repellents, use of horse clothing. All those things are like creating the fire breaks and using goats and cattle to eat the grass so that you don't have the danger of fire. Steroids are like the plane with a fire retardant. They're what you use when you're in the middle of a really severe response, and you need to put a wedge in that circle of ever perpetual itch, scratch, itch, scratch, itch, scratch. One more thing, and then we're going to have a pause here in a minute so I can take some questions. Adjunctive therapy for dermal hypersensitivities. Here again, if you're reading the horse magazines or you're getting Smart Pack catalogs, there is a plethora of things to feed your horse to help their skin. The one thing that has shown with peer-reviewed scientific evidence to decrease some of the allergic response are omega-3 fatty acids, commonly found in flaxseed. Omega Horseshine, Triple Crown, Omega Max are two commercial products, heavy with flaxseed. The Omega Horseshine has a stabilized flaxseed meal in it because it is an oil and it will degrade in the environments. There are other supplements such as Platinum Performance and Kinetic SA that also contain omega-3s. These contain other compounds to decrease inflammation as well as omega-3s. And they are something that may be the last final push you need to get control of allergies in the skin of the horse. So in summary, what we can say is, how do we diagnose and manage it? One, we have a history, the appropriate clinical signs, and the response to avoidance. Avoidance, by using all the means you can to control the environment, use barriers, repellents, fans, etc. If you don't practice avoidance in the best way you cannot expect your horse to become normal. It is absolutely an integral part of IBH. Local skincare. Here again, start with something simple: cool water hosing, soothing baths, being sure to dilute the shampoo and not to bathe them too often, the use of supplements, and then trial and error. You may find antihistamines that help. You might find that you need systemic steroids in order to get a handle on the itch scratch cycle while you're implementing all the other things that we do to try and control IBH. And then I'm going to pause here before I talk about allergen-specific immune therapy and let Angie bring some of your questions.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions here, so don't worry, we have plenty of time. We're just going to keep going until we're finished. So we want to make sure we get your questions answered, so don't be shy. Brenda has a question. I'm going to see if we can unmute her and get her to ask her question to the group. So Brenda, you can unmute yourself now. Down there in the lower left-hand corner, I believe, should be your button. So if you can do that, then you can go ahead and ask your question. And if you can't get it to work, don't worry, just type it in the Q&A box and I'll ask it. Okay. I don't see Brenda coming on yet. So let's go to some of the other questions that we have, and we'll go back to Brenda, or Brenda, you can just type yours in the Q&A box. The first question we have here is there a good source of omega-3 for a horse that is allergic to flaxseed?
There are commercial products of omega-3s, Kentucky Equine Performance. They have omega-3 liquid supplement that is derived from fish oil.
Mm-hmm. I think it's called Nano E. Is that right? Or am I thinking of something
No,
else?
you're thinking of, they also have a liquid vitamin E supplement.
Okay.
But I believe that is one place that you can get a fish oil derived omega-3 that is not flaxseed. Some people want to create their own flaxseed meal, and they can use a wearing blender or a coffee blender to blend flaxseed. It's oily. It makes a mess. You can put rice in afterwards and sort of dry everything out, but you have to do a lot of it. You need initially, if you're using omega-3s, you need as much as a pound a day. And so I wonder what source of flaxseed you were using, and what the allergy signs were. But irrespective, I'll trust that you have that. And if you go to Kentucky Equine Performance, Google it, you'll get what their products are. You need to go through a veterinarian to get it, but it is available.
I think I'm on the website here and it says EO3. That's what it is.
Yeah.
EO3.
So it has E and omega-3s in it, I think.
Okay. We have a question about, is there a best time of year to get your vet involved to try and diagnose what type of insect hypersensitivity you might have? Is it better to do it in the summertime when they might be active, or in the wintertime so that you can get a jump on it before the bugs come out?
Well, it's impossible to know what insects you have unless they're there. So usually what kind of insects are the worst offenders, they're usually observed and identified at the time that the insects are present in the summer. The other part of that question, and I'm going to get to intradermal testing for allergens and blood testing for allergens. So let's just put that on a shelf for right now, because there's pluses and minuses to doing those tests. I will say, however, if you have a horse right now with IBH, August tends to be one of the worst months. They've been building up to it all summer, and it goes right through September and October in the Southeast. Remember, we have our really tough insects that are present in the fall. They've lived through everything you've used to try and kill them, and they're super insects. What you want to do is get a jump on controlling that horse the next spring before you have that badly affected horse.
Perfect. Okay. Next question is, how do you feel about the fly systems that are in the barn that, spray down
the
flies?
permethrin fly systems? They can be very irritating. Hopefully when you use them, your horses are not in the barn. We used to have those at the University of Georgia in the teaching hospital previous to the one we're in right now, the second teaching hospital. The one we're using now is the third. And it was incredibly irritating for people. And it can be irritating for horses. And then there are some horses that will develop an allergy to the product that's being used. If it's what you have in your barn and it's used judiciously, I think it's one more thing that you can use to help control the flies. If it's possible for you to use feed through Fly reproduction inhibitors are fly predators themselves. I think they're a better solution. But here again, it depends on your situation. If you're in the middle of a bunch of people that are doing no fly control, the predators and inhibitors will not work, and maybe this is your best solution. Given a preference, I don't like them.
Okay. This question is Friesian specific, and I happen to have the research paper here if you don't have it and have the answer. But the question is, do we know what the rate of occurrence of IBH is in Friesian horses?
There was a paper, is this the one published in 2011?
I think so. It was done after, I think it was
Dutch Friesians.
KFPS, and they went around to all the inspections and did.
Yeah, and I think it was somewhere around 18 to 20%.
Yeah, it was 18%. That's right. Yep.
IBH is, the incidence is anywhere between 10% up to 60%, depending on the population you're looking at, and a whole bunch of other factors. The only place you don't see IBH is in Iceland, because they have no Culicoides gnats. And so they used to think that the Icelandic horses were, they didn't get IBH. Well, they do if you bring them here, or they go to Europe.
And weren't Icelandics, I could be wrong, but weren't they the breed that they were testing a vaccine with? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, in
and
Europe.
I know we're going to talk about that stuff later, but
yeah, in Europe. And that's because I think the people that were doing the research had a ready population of Icelandics, that because, you know, you bring them here, you take them to Europe, they get IBH too.
Right. Next question we have is about garlic. So this person says, I've been feeding granulated garlic to my horses for the past 3 years, and I have hardly had any flies, only when the horses are sweaty, and it seems to repel the other biting insects. I rarely use fly spray and have no flies on the manure. Someone said this isn't good for horses. Is there any data on this?
I don't think there's any data for garlic not being good for horses. I will say, I don't know what your particular situation is, but garlic's been used by a large number of people, and it doesn't work in every situation for sure.
Okay.
What I'm trying to get across here, I think, is that there isn't a silver bullet that you're going to use, and that's going to be the be all end all of your problem with IBH, particularly in today's time where we see more and more atopic horses. You know, I'm old enough that when I look back growing up with horses, we did not have a lot of IBH, and atopy was thought not that long ago to not exist in horses, which we now know is certainly not true, that it does exist in horses. So I personally, if I had a client that had clinical IBH in their horse, I would not recommend they feed garlic to their horse. I will not tell you not to do it. And if it seems to be working for you, I don't know of any information that it's harmful.
Okay. Liv has a question, and she wants to know, is it safe to administer feed through fly inhibitors to pregnant or nursing mares?
Yes, I think so. I haven't read the label because I don't use it, and I haven't read the label recently. But when you see products that says on the label, not tested or not for or not whatever use in pregnant mares, that usually means when they develop this particular product and they went through the required testing for safety, they didn't use any pregnant horses.
Right.
What the feed through is it inhibits the development of chitin, and mammals don't make chitin. So I can't answer that. You know, that's the best thing I can say, but I would seriously
read your labels, right? Read your labels carefully.
Yeah.
Another question we have, and I will say last call for questions on this segment, and then we'll move on, and we will have final questions at the end if there's no more breaks in between. But this question is about horses changing environments. Is it possible for a horse to come from an environment such as being imported or moving from another region and never having any symptoms, and then arriving at a new home and all of a sudden they have a bunch of symptoms of insect bite hypersensitivity?
Absolutely. The Morgan family tree that I put up there, those people came from California. They had no symptoms in their horses, and they brought that bunch to the East Coast, and bingo. One of the case examples I'm going to show you, it was my own personal horse. He came out of Pennsylvania, and he came to live in South Carolina, Georgia. And a year after he arrived, he was a poster boy for IBH. So I never had a horse that I had to manage so intensively with IBH before. I thought it was only probably deserved, since I talk about it all the time. But yes, that can happen.
And then on the flip side of that, the next question is, really, if you have this issue and you've tried everything and can't resolve it, is it, a good resort to move the horse to a different climate?
I've had clients do that with horses that had really severe equine asthma that couldn't be controlled in the Southeast, and clients moved them west, and the horses came off all medication and became clinically normal. Yes, if you can do that, if you can do that. It depends. There is not a region in the United States in which IBH does not occur. So your particular horse or horses that were fine in the Western United States and moved east, or the Northeast and moved south, it may work the other direction as well.
I guess that I'll ask you this question just so the audience can hear it. Have you ever seen a case that you couldn't make a clinical improvement in once someone with your level of expertise or a dermatologist got involved? Have you ever seen horses that just can't be managed?
I can, if I have a willing client, and one of the things that I tell people, if you don't give up, I don't give up. It may take quite a while, but we can improve every horse. We may not make them 100% perfect, and I have some case examples of that, but we can certainly improve every horse. And that's another message. You have to use a multimodal approach to controlling this problem. And if you think back to that grade horse that had the big area that was completely scarred from chronic IBH, I'm not going to reverse that. If you have that kind of skin scarring, that's there for life. But if it's insect allergies, we can make a big difference. It just takes time. As I said, there's not a silver bullet. You have to work, and that's what I currently do. I work with veterinarians that have very difficult cases of pruritus in horses, and together we try and solve their clients' horses' problem.
But I think it's safe to say, as you mentioned, don't wait until it gets to the point where it's super bad, right? If you're seeing these signs, like, take action. Yes.
And, remember the three things. You have to have the genetic predisposition. You have to have exposure to the insect. And also what we're going to show in the second half here is the balance of the exposure to the allergen and the occurrence of clinical signs. If you have a year in which you don't have too many insects for whatever reason, it didn't rain, it never got hot, etc., the clinical signs may be less, and it may not be what you're doing. And this is where a lot of the voodoo medicine comes in. You can get on the internet and you can find, I call it Dr. Google, and or the barn owner's friend cousin who knew a trainer that said, this always works. Sometimes the improvement you see, the waxing and waning of clinical signs may be due to the exposure.
Okay, well, that's all. We've answered all the questions, so I think we can move on to the next part, which I think everybody will find very interesting.
Okay, so we talked about this acquired allergy. And when I was a whole lot younger, horses that did get IBH, they tended to occur sort of mid-age adult, and then they got worse as time went on. And now we see horses with skin allergies that are 2 years old and sometimes even younger. And these horses are most likely to be atopic animals. And A to B, which occurs in dogs, it occurs in people, is a genetically programmed disease. Here we go again. It's the composition of the gene makeup. And then if we're going to get really sophisticated, it's when those genes are expressed that causes a horse or a patient to become sensitized to normal environmental antigens that horses that are non-atopic never develop an allergy to. And if you have an atopic dog, you're probably well schooled in this. There's lots of atopy in dogs. Some breeds more than others, and they itch. And so they have all the same clinical signs that IBH does, because if they itch, they scratch, they lose their hair, they excoriate their skin, they get secondary infections, etc. And also, they very commonly have urticaria, which is the medical term for hives, which is shown on this horse. We've got these flat areas that are dark, those are resolved hives. We have all these individual hives. We have coalescing hives. Oops, my pointer and my advancer are the same thing. And so they commonly, the horses that are atopic commonly have IBH. And it's just like we talked about before, the innate immune function means that's what they were born with. They were born with a genetic makeup that makes them predisposed. Then it depends on what they're exposed to and what the immune reaction is to what they're exposed to. And the most important thing, I should have a star right here, that says in atopic animals, skin barrier structure and function is abnormal. So they can not only, if you're a person or a dog or a horse, inhale the antigen, eat the antigen, have it injected because it's, an insect bites you, it can just go through the skin because that protective layer of the epidermis is not doing its job. Now, this schematic of skin is straight out of the Horse magazine. And what it shows is that there is the epidermis. This is the barrier function here. And underneath that is the dermis that has all the blood vessels and the hair follicles and the sweat glands and the oil glands, the sebaceous glands. And the top of this epidermal barrier is keratinized, which means it's the same substance that makes the hoof, only a whole lot thinner. And in and around the keratin and down in the dermal layer, there's different kinds of lipids. And there has been shown in dogs and people that these are abnormal. They don't make an impermeable barrier. And so that allows allergens to penetrate the skin and have access to all those cells, antibodies, cytokines, et cetera, that are living down here in the epidermis. So this is an atopic horse, and what I'm showing you is it looks just like an IBH horse. It rubs its ventral abdomen. It's got excoriation where you're seeing some blood, so it's down into the dermis. It's got hair loss. It's got signs of itching up its neck and on its chest. So to try and determine what the horse's immune response is reacting to, there's two different kinds of tests that try and find the presence of antibodies, that IgE that is made to react to that allergen, or to identify the fact that the skin has that big adverse reaction when you put the allergen into the dermis itself, not in the circulation or the muscle or the subcu. So this is a quick and easy test. You just get a blood sample from a horse. Your veterinarian sends it off to a laboratory that uses a array of tests. They have allergens that are, we hope in today's time, more purified, and then they have a method to look to see if your horse's plasma or serum has antibodies that will attach to those allergens. It's usually done by a color test, so if it turns the right color, yes, it's there. Criticisms of this particular test is that, and there's a really good scientific paper out in the last, time flies, it's less than 5 years, where it was shown that a normal horse will have antibodies to the substances that a non-normal horse has. They just don't react to them. And so you have circulating antibodies to specific allergens, which may be causing no disease. So does it specifically and sensitively identify what the offenders are? No, it doesn't. But it does a pretty good job if the lab you're using is looking at how extensive the reaction is, how much IgG is there. The other test that can be done is the intradermal testing. It's long been considered by dermatologists as the gold standard, because we know we could have circulating IgG out here in the blood, but we don't know if it's doing anything in the skin. So if we look for the reaction in the skin, then we can say that the allergen is causing that reaction in the skin. And this is just a typical grid pattern. Each dot is a different allergen. And then you wait a period of time, and the ones that are reactive, they get a big reaction, and the ones that are not reactive tend to fade away pretty quickly. The downside of this particular test is that normal horses will show reaction in their skin sometimes and not have clinical disease. So both are useful, both are inexact. And when I start down the road of using intradermal skin testing or serologic determination of specific antibodies, I tell the clients that these are inexact, but they're a really good tool for today's time. So when you do the IDT, you want to use insects. You want to use foods, dust, environmental plants. Here's a list of what we do in Georgia. There's all the allergens drawn up in little tiny syringes. The same thing happens when you do a blood sample. They have a means by which they can test for the adherence of antibodies onto their allergens, which are linked to color, and give you a list. Now, this is really important. When you use either test and you're looking for the offending allergen, this is not used to make a diagnosis. You have to use your clinical signs, your history, and ruling out everything else that could also make the horse look like this. And I'll list that towards the end of this session, which is another reason you need your veterinarian to help you, because it's a long list. IDT, or serologic sampling, is used only to identify the most likely allergens that are the offending ones, and to create allergen-specific immune therapy. Here we like acronyms. We call it ASIT. It's too big of a mouthful. And so what is ASIT? We commonly refer, people get these. You may yourself have had this done at some point in your life. They are often referred to as hyposensitization shots. We don't have 100% handle on how ASIT works in the animals that it does improve, or the people it does improve. But it is, I just lost my train of thought there, and I apologize for that. But anyhow, let's get back to what it actually is. It's a composition of selected allergens. You give it on a regular schedule of increasing allergen concentration. And when the desired control is reached, then you determine, here again, individually, a maintenance schedule for each individual. This can take variable periods of time. Generally, it takes several months to a year to get the full benefit of using ASIT. And what you're trying to do is retrain the immune system to try and get it to think that these guys are around, these allergens are around all the time. We've reacted to them. They're not important. It's interesting, I think, that in younger atopic horses, ASIT is more helpful. You get a better response. You often get it quicker. Older horses with chronic severe IBH are often non-responsive to ASIT. The current papers that are available on the use of ASIT in horses say that you can improve 70 to 80% of the horses using ASIT. Remember, if your horse is out there in the 20%, you're going to be very disappointed. And so that's why when I talk about the use of ASIT in horses with HB or HB plus IBH, I tell them it is not guaranteed, but it's generally, I think it's generally worth a try, because it may improve them enough so that you can do a few other things and get complete control. So let's talk about the sensation of itch. I just said not too long ago that histamine is responsible for approximately 30% of the itch sensation. Most of the itch is caused by a cell mediator, a specific cytokine called IL-31. And if you have a dog with HB, or if you have a horse that's been driving you crazy trying to figure out how to control it, Apoquel is a drug that inhibits an enzyme that is part of the signaling pathway of itch that uses IL-31. So Apoquel has been enormously successful in dogs. Now, I've brought it up because veterinarians have used Apoquel in a non-label approved manner. It tends to be somewhat expensive because it was put on the market and priced for dogs that don't weigh 1,200 pounds. Here again, you have to sort of adjust the dose. And I'm only mentioning it because I imagine that many of you may have found in social media, chat groups, horse magazines, your friends, animals that are on Apoquel. The future of helping horses with pruritus that is very difficult to control is vaccination against cell mediators that induce the sensation of itch. And this has been done, and there's some really wonderful papers out there that talk about the vaccination against IL-5, a cell mediator that gets you towards eosinophils, which then get you to IL-31, and then the latest papers against IL-31 themselves. The small number of horses they've used in their clinical trials, it is very successful. We're all waiting on pins and needles for this to go commercial, but it's not ready for prime time yet. If we ever get a commercial available IL-31 vaccination for use in horses, it will be enormously helpful for the comfort of horses, because there are many reasons that we cannot control IBH, or there may be other unidentified reasons for pruritus in the horse. So if we're going to solve pruritus in the horse, we have to have a detailed history, extremely important. You are the person who spends the most time with the horse. and you're capable of having a very precise and detailed history, which will be enormously helpful to your veterinarian. I encourage you to write it down. None of us have infallible memories. This has been proven over and over again. When MDs and veterinarians remember this and this about a case, and then you compare it to the medical record and realize that your memory isn't what you thought it was. You need to rule out all possible diagnoses that may be the problem or occurring concurrently with the IBH. Secondary infections are very common. You have to treat it before you can get to the basic allergy to the horse. You want to treat pruritus symptomatically. That goes back to the cool water hosing, soothing baths, topical therapy. And you want to use simple diets. And that's because animals that are allergic, having a genetic predisposition to develop allergies, often have more than one. And so usually when I get an undiagnosed bad pruritic skin disease in, to me, I ask the client, okay, you have to agree to get rid of all supplements for a 3 to 4 week period of time. If your horse is on a mixed sweet feed, I would like you to not use a mixed feed or use a extruded one that has been, heated and you're disrupting the proteins. Sometimes just by doing that, you may improve the horse. There was a question about a horse that's allergic to flaxseed. Horses that are allergic to anything that they eat, alfalfa is a common problem. Supplements are usually in an alfalfa base. So, you have to take a very careful look at what supplements you're using. Use the best avoidance possible. I should have put this in red. Absolutely necessary to see substantial improvement. So, allergen exposure and the production of clinical signs. Allergen exposure is additive. So if you have lots and lots of insects, all different ones of them, all on the horse, they're going to weight this teeter-totter down and your clinical signs are going to go way up. If you have less antigen exposure, may not gotten rid of it, but you've decreased it, then you'll see a decrease in clinical signs. And so there are papers that show that horses with IBH are more likely to have asthma. Horses with asthma are more likely to have IBH or develop down the time. So when you're thinking about managing this horse with IBH, you should manage it like it has asthma. You should get rid of as much dust as possible. Maybe you should be thoroughly wetting the forage that the animal's eating if they're eating dry hay. All the things that you would do for an equine asthma case, you should do for any horse with allergies. And so hopefully you've cottoned on to this already. You have to be persistent. And this is a line that I use with every client that makes their way to me. They've usually come through another veterinarian. And I say, and I tell veterinarians this all the time when I talk to them, you should allow your veterinarian 50% of the time the condition has been present to improve the horse. Everyone wants instant success. In this situation, it doesn't occur unless you move the horse, to Iceland or something. You need to understand that atopy and hypersensitivity are lifelong. So management is forever. And many of these horses are very management intensive. And unless you can really decrease exposure to allergens, there you are. You're going to be doing, just get used to the fact you're going to be doing it for a long time. And you add that to the other diseases that we talked about, like particularly this link between asthma and IBH. So now what I'd like to do is just share some clinical cases with you. And what I'm trying to do is, if you're horrified that you'll never be able to control your horse. I'm going to try and show you that there are different approaches that work in different situations. And you don't have to do everything for every horse. Sally. Sally is a broodmare on a large quarter horse breeding farm, lived on Bermuda pasture in coastal South Carolina. And if we think that Georgia's the bug capital of the world, well, way South Georgia, the sand flats of South Carolina are absolutely hideous. And so you can tell she's one of a lot of horses because she's got a 125 neck band on here. I think that the time I saw Sally, they were breeding 300 mares. So she's out in pasture, no treatment. Does she look happy? No, she doesn't. She looks really miserable. She's got every clinical sign. She has no mane. She's got excoriation. She's got sign of definitive bug bites. Her face is affected and she is not a happy camper. Well, Sally, let's go back for a minute. Sally, the manager of this farm, changed, and the new manager had his wife felt inordinately sorry for Sally. And so she wanted to know what could be done for Sally. And so what we did is we stabled Sally under fans during the day. We used a long-acting repellent spray when she was out. She got a bath every week. She got the use of topical steroids as needed on the worst affected areas. And here, what I was using is I was using an antibiotic and a steroid mix that would be rubbed on really severely affected areas. And this is all that happened. And it cost time mostly. And the wife of the manager was willing to give it. And so we got adequate control of the pruritus and the skin lesions. Sally gained weight. Sally was happier. She was rebred easier. Her foals were happier. And that's all we had to do. And she lived in a really severe environment. So I promised you the horse that was mine. This is a 10-year-old English cob, which came from Pennsylvania. This particular photograph is 2 years after he arrived first in South Carolina and then in Georgia. He had no problems with his skin whatsoever during his life in the Northeast. And this is an incident. You can see these dark areas. I was out of town. I had a veterinary technician that used to help me out a lot and take care of my horses when I wasn't there. These are all urticaria lesions that have collapsed. You can see where he's rubbed himself. You can see he has bites. You can see where he's rubbed himself here. He was pretty much the classic IBH horse when you change environments. So what did we do with him? One, he had access to fans 24/7. Here again, this is fans in my barn. I had these in the stalls and I had a shed roof over the barn with a paddock so they could stand in the paddock and not in the stalls if they wanted to. And I had fans out there. I used fly predators on the property. I used fly traps on the property. And I used them away from the barn. He wore a fly mask. He got daily hosing and cool water baths intermittently. He got a permethrin spray in the evening. Here you can see better some of the lesions. I used a hydrocortisone spray as needed when he had worsening periods of pruritus, and he was on hydroxyzine 350 milligrams BID. I chose hydroxyzine because of his propensity to develop urticaria, and hydroxyzine does a bit better job of controlling urticaria, even though its metabolite is to another antihistamine. And as long as I did all of those things religiously all the time, he was well controlled. Here's another example of Bailey. At this photo, she's 12 years old. She's a Connemara cross that has been owned by a good friend of mine since she was a yearling or 2 years old. And Bailey has had skin issues since she was a yearling or two. I mean, my friend bought this filly knowing that she had skin problems. She was in an inexpensive mare, and the decision was made that she could probably manage the skin and get a nice horse. And you'll see close-ups, but you can see she has bite areas that she's excoriated. And can you see these? They look like stripes on her body. That's lateral or linear urticaria, very common in atopic horses. Here's an example of the lesions in her skin on her legs. She used to chew her legs horribly. So she got cool water baths and a leave-on 1% hydrocortisone rinse. She got a pyrethroid spray. She wore a fly sheet, and she got topical steroid spray as needed. And Bailey was not 100% controlled. She was not a show animal. She was primarily a trail horse. And she had exacerbations. She got worse and better as time went on. Here you can see she's looking pretty darn good. I put this in. This is a Sturgis fly sheet. She was Houdini. She would get out of actually, Lisa tried a number of fly sheets on her. This is the one she would wear. That's the one she wore. And I mentioned that earlier. There's so many to choose from now. You find the one that the horse will wear. Is she atopic? I would think so. And I think I may be missing some slides. No. Probably. I think she was probably atopic, and this was manifested primarily because as IBH, and she was managed well enough to be a solid trail horse for, I don't know, pushing 20 years, 17, 18 years. So we talked about this, that ASIT, gradually increasing concentrations, improvement over 6 to 12 months usually, and the earlier question, when should you do these things to try and control IBH? The time to begin ASIT is in the non-insect season when the clinical signs are not at their peak. Now, we've been known to start horses on ASIT in the height of the worst of the itch, scratch, inflammation cycle, but the benefits are slower, are less likely to be helpful. So it is important, if you can, to time injection series. So maintenance dose is reached at the onset of insect season, which for us is generally March, early April in the Southeast. So let's say it's August. Your horse is scratching themselves to death. You're frantic. Your veterinarian rules out a whole bunch of other diseases. You decide together a 2-week course of steroids to put a wedge in that itch scratch cycle. Meanwhile, you're taking excellent care of the skin and you're managing the environment the horse lives in to the best of your ability. Eventually, it's going to cool off and the insects are going to decrease, and that's the ideal time to start your ASIT. When the horse's skin is maximally inflamed and you do an IDT test, you're going to get more reactions than you would if you did it when the skin was not inflamed, because the whole inflammation system is all geared up and revved up and primed to be overreactive. I have tested horses with IDT that are in the height of clinical signs because that's when they've been presented. But ideally, that's when you like to do it. So let's talk about Chief. In this photo, he's 19 years old and he was a free horse. And we all know that there's no such thing as a free horse. Generally, they end up costing you more money than anything else. And this is an older case. You can see we're in the 90s. which to some of you is ancient history, but some of us not that long ago. During the year of 94 to 95, he had mild generalized pruritus, and he was sprayed daily with pyrethrins. And you can see why they took him. He was totally safe. In 96, he had really bad pruritus, self-mutilization, bleeding lesions. He was sprayed with pyrethrins, and he was on systemic steroids every other day. By 1997, daily pyrethrins, increased dose of steroids given every day, controlled the worst of the self-mutilization, but didn't really solve the problem. So in 1998, we did an ID skin test and began hyposensitization, or ASIT. And this is important. If you begin ASIT when the horse is showing clinical signs, they're going to need whatever you're doing, if you're using steroids, for a period of time after you start ASIT, because ASIT doesn't kick in for a while. So let's try and get that horse under control. Let's use that emergency crisis steroid dose to help the horse through the crisis. So we did put him on the ASIT, and then we get to the summer of 99, we continued the hyposensitization. Oral steroids were used during the one episode that was really intense, and using hyposensitization alone, the horse was 90% improved. So, no, he's not normal, but quality of life wise, the horse is a lot better. And he lived in the pasture. He did not live in a stall. His owners worked. They could give him attention every day, but generally it was given once a day. He was not in a highly managed situation. So here's another example of a young horse. This is Webby. She's a 4-year-old warm blood filly. And she came to me in the winter. This is winter in Athens, from Pensacola, Florida. She had a 2-year history in Florida. You know where that is. It's down right there. Bugs are horrible. 2-year history of intense pruritus, a history of insect allergies. She moved to Athens when she was 4, and the pruritus persisted in the winter. And if you look at Webby, you see these lines. This is another one of those horses exhibiting that linear urticaria. So and you can see she's lost hair up here. She's scratching. You can't see her rear end too well. It's winter. She's still scratching. And so here's a better shot of that linear urticaria. This young horse, I'm sure, has reactions to insect bites, but she's atopic as well because we don't have insects, and she's still itching and she still has skin lesions. So we did the intradermal skin test. We found that she was highly reactive to Bahia grass and insects. We removed her from Bahia grass pasture and hay. And for those of you who don't live in the Southeast and don't know what Bahia is, it's very closely related to crabgrass. One of the things that grows well in adverse poor soils, conditions in poor soils. We use mechanical avoidance therapy. We simplified her diet. We use hyposensitization. And this was an owner that absolutely positively refused to use any steroids whatsoever. And the reason was that in the barn the horse lived in Pensacola, there was high doses of potent steroids given systemically to a lot of horses that had pruritus and were reacting to insects. And a couple of them subsequently had severe laminitis and had to be euthanized. And so she said, absolutely not, no steroids getting near this horse. A year of follow-up, we had this horse 80% improved. And I think we would have improved the horse more if the owner was more diligent in other management strategies. And so there was a question about, well, how do you, what about identifying the insect? And this is one of my favorite cases on identifying the insect. Bill is an 8-year-old mule. He gets used for pulling contests, and he's one of a pair. And so Bill is affected and his teammate is not. He had a really poor response to topical treatment and systemic steroids. And the owner, mountain man that he was a little annoyed. He'd had topical treatment, he'd spent money on steroids, and he thought since he treated his mule, he should be better. The mule was pastured during the day and stabled at night. And there was a very large population of stable and house flies on this property. So we did an intradermal skin test on Bill, and we had a late, real severe reaction to Musca domestica, which is a fly antigen. This is a case from a while ago, and one of the problems with doing IDT skin tests in the past is you didn't have purified antigens. The original fly antigen was the whole fly or the whole Culicoides. Think about that. It's pretty hard to tease out the salivary glands of a Culicoides gnat and get enough of them to make a product that you can use. But in today's time, we have much more specific antigens, which is a good thing because it makes the IDT test more reliable. So with the history, and some of that I got from the wife and not the owner, we decided that stable flies were probably the worst offender. And I was not going to use ASIT on this mule because the owner was already primed that if failure occurred, he was going to be one unhappy camper. And he didn't seem like he would have the patience to wait a long enough time. So what did I do? I recommended that he stable the mule in fans during the day, to use a permethrin spray when he went out at night. And this is when the only barrier mesh permethrin impregnated blanket available was the Royal Riders Expel. And then to use on the worst cases that he excoriated and got some bleeding, to use a topical steroid combined with a topical antimicrobial as needed on specific lesions. And we improved the mule to virtually normal. And so that way, using what the owner was willing to do or not do, and figuring out that the stable flies were the worst offender, we were able to improve that horse or that mule so that the owner and the mule were both happy. So I've talked about urticaria. Here's another nice example of a horse with urticaria. Sometimes horses get hives because they've been exposed to new bedding or they're on a showground or whatever. And whether you treat them or not, they go away in about 72 hours and the horse goes back to their normal environment and things are fine. Other times, horses can have recurrent urticaria that comes and goes or is persistent. Those are probably the most difficult cases that I deal with. They can be dealt with. I didn't put in a horse in here. I had a high performance dressage horse out of New Mexico. I worked with a veterinarian there on a recurrent urticaria horse. It took us 6 months, but we were able to control him to where he could have his job back. So if we think about urticaria alone, stinging and biting insects, you see these big urticaria lesions here. This horse was stung by wasps. I know this. I was on a trail ride with the owner of this horse and we saw the wasp sting the horse. So yes, it was painful. It was a temporary problem. Different drugs and vaccines can cause urticaria. Certain skin infections can cause urticaria or systemic infections. Contactants. This is like the permethrin spray that you put on your horse or the shampoo, or the over-the-counter best antifungal spray known to mankind can cause a severe reaction that can be exhibited as urticaria or excoriated lesions and hair loss. Vasculitis can cause urticaria. There are really rare but interesting cases of cold stress or exercise-induced lesions, immune-mediated diseases, and we already talked about atopy. Another thing that you should probably be aware of, if you have older horses and they've been diagnosed with PPID, and one of the characteristics of PPID is a loss of diurnal rhythms of natural cortisol or an increase in cortisol. And if that PPID horse goes on Presen to treat the disease, and we no longer have an excess concentration or the diurnal rhythm comes back, then we may see IBH that wasn't there before. So that's just something for you to think of. Or if they had IBH, it might get worse. So that's something, and pergolide is the generic name for Presen. So that's something to think about as your horses age and you become aware of and concerned about PPID. And this is the poster child with the long curly hair coat. Okay, differential diagnosis. I said that we would talk about this, and this is why your veterinarian needs to be involved in this. Onchocerciasis. All these things is a whole nother webinar. Onchocerciasis is, I think, on the increase since we have strategic deworming of horses trying desperately to keep from having resistance to every known anthelmintic that we have for horses. Onchocerca larvae that live in the skin. When they die in the skin, the horse can get an allergic reaction, and then they scratch and it looks just like everything we've looked at the whole evening. So that's a possibility. Immune-mediated diseases, one of the most common is pemphigus. This is a horse with pemphigus, can look very similar to IBH. I've talked a lot about secondary infections. Superficial staphylococcal infections can look, can come on top of IBH and can cause alopecia and a sort of a generalized scaliness of the skin. Fungal diseases can do the same thing. Ringworm can have, can be very pruritic and create areas of excoriation caused by the horse. Mites, lice, and ticks, that's a whole other presentation, all of which can be very pruritic. Vasculitis, we talked about contact and drug reactions, and food allergies, which are actually pretty rare in the horse. There's one horse that's never going to suffer from IBH. So are there any other questions that you have?
Yeah, I do have a few here. And so if you're in the audience and you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. I'll go through these that we have. Do you need a dermatologist to do the IDAT or ACIT, or is that something that any, let's say, rural veterinarian with a ambulatory practice can do?
I would encourage a rural veterinarian with an ambulatory practice to probably use the serologic determination of offending antigens, rather than an IDT. Doing intradermal skin testing is a skill. If you do not inject each antigen in precisely the same volume, in precisely the same depth of the skin, you're going to get reactions that are dependent on your injection technique. So having somebody who does it all the time is liable to do a more standardized test. The other thing is that the antigens that are used in IDT come dehydrated and frozen and lyophilized, and they're reconstituted. You can only reconstitute the vial that the lyophilized antigens come in so many times, and then they're out of date. Once you reconstitute them, they have a very short half-life when they have to be used. And so oftentimes a rural veterinarian wouldn't want to spend the money to have the antigens to do the test. But, you know, personally, I like IDT, but I think that rural general practitioner can probably do a reasonably and a good job doing the serologic testing. Then you have to decide, because a lot of times what happens is you get this long list of substances that the horse has antibodies against, and you should not put more than about 12. I usually don't like any more than 10 antigens in an ASIT solution that you inject in the horse. You have to pick out the ones that are most likely to be the offenders. And that has to be with the history of the horse and the environment of the horse. And that's one thing that general practitioners in an ambulatory truck have an advantage. They get to examine the premises. You know, when I was on the faculty at University of Georgia, I had to have a really good relationship with referring veterinarians because they were my eyes on the property in many instances.
So maybe if you wanted to do the IDAT, if that was your preference as an owner, it would be better to have your veterinarian refer you to a university or a larger practice with a dermatology department.
Yes, but that's not feasible for everybody.
Sure.
And so if their general practitioner takes a serologic sample, sends it in, the solutions that you use to inject your horse are sent to you by the company that makes the allergens and does the test. And so they will send those to the veterinarian who dispenses them to you, and then you're the one who's going to be giving them. It's a very small volume. Unless you have a horse that's excessively needle shy, this is something you can do.
Perfect. Next question is, what is the general price difference between the two tests, serological and IDAT? Like, do you have any idea, you know, just a ballpark figure?
You know, I would say the I'm afraid I really can't answer that, and I apologize because I'm always in my consultation position now. I'm usually advising other people, and it depends. You know, if you get an IDT done, let's say at a university hospital, you know, the cost is getting you there and getting admitted. It's like going anywhere else with a hospital. You pay an upfront charge to get a record and everything. I've had veterinarians that have talked to small animal veterinarians that do a lot of IDT, and they may get antigens from that veterinarian and do the IDT themselves. But I think it's more expensive to do the IDT than to do the serologic test. In the big picture, it's not that expensive to do the testing and have at least a year's trial with ASIT. When I talk to people, I used to say, how much do you pay for hock injections? It doesn't cost more than that.
Right.
And you know, if you don't blink an eye at having Medicaid, you know, joint injections for maintenance or for treating a specific lameness, then I don't think it's too much out of the realm. And you can always ask. Yeah. Before you agree to do something, get an estimate, because I dare say it will vary between places and people.
Sure. And I can, for the person that asked this question, I can tell you the two IDATs that I had done on my Friesians, you know, most Friesian owners have insurance. So my insurance covered the cost of the testing and the therapy afterwards, and even the hydroxyzine. And my entire cost at Auburn University, which was very recent, that was for everything: the exam, the IDAT, and the immunotherapy, and the prescription medications they gave me. All that together was about $700. So yeah, in comparison to how much time and energy I spent on trying to manage and treat the horse with topicals and sprays and the stress of it, that was money well spent for me personally. So,
and tell them how successful it's been.
I've had 2 Friesians go through IDAT, and both of them responded beautifully and do not wear fly sheets, and they just get the weekly allergy shot. I do use the Flaxseed, Omega Horseshine, but yeah, they're living absolutely normal lives, and they have, you know, hair down to below their shoulder. So it saved us for sure. So I personally, it was a great experience for me, but you know, we got in the vet involved quickly, and so it was a good success story. Do you have any idea how often atopic horses are mislabeled or potentially misdiagnosed for just having insect bite hypersensitivity? Like, so if an owner sees these signs, they might just think it's just flies when they have actually a larger issue going on.
Oh, I think that's probably pretty common. Now, remember, if it's just flies and gnats, it's seasonal. If you're in a truly temperate area where you have winter and summer and different seasons. But yeah, I mean, Bailey's a good example of that. The Arab that had pruritus and skin issues from the time she was 1 or 2 years old, that was controlled by a simple diet, a skin supplement, and management. She had periods of waxing and waning, again, depending on the pressure that she had.
Okay, the next question is there any benefit to going back and retesting, redoing the IDAT after you've had several years of immunotherapy to see if your horse can ever come off of the shots?
I would say that the retesting, you know, I've never had anybody do that. I've had people that just have come off them.
Oh,
You know, quit giving them. And I know people, humans, when as children are tested for allergies and given ASIT, and then the shots are discontinued and they are improved and they go on, my sister being a good example, they go on to live an adult life without demonstrable allergies. If it's been, you know, I honestly, I could hypothesize and think and speculate, but I really don't know how to answer that question. I think it's probable that some horses could come off, particularly the young ones that have been on it for several years. And I'm extrapolating from humans. I have not had clients that I know of that have retested a horse after they've been on the allergy shots for a prolonged period of time.
okay.
I think one thing you could do, I don't know what your maintenance interval is, but you know, the average is 4 weeks. Some horses can't go that long. Some horses can go longer. And so if you've been giving the injections, just pick a time, every 4 weeks, you might try stretching them out to 5 for a while and see what happens. Remember, if there's an insect component of this, you have to do this when there's insect pressure, not in the winter. And then stretching it out to, you know, again, and then if you get out to where you're like 8 or more weeks out, you could probably discontinue them.
Okay, and the final question we have is, if you have had an IDAT done and you're treating the horse, and then you move to a new climate that's completely different, what should you do? Should you go back and do a new IDAT with the allergens that are a problem in that particular region? Or
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, there you go. Okay, that is the last question, and I've been through allergy treatment, but I tell you what, I learned a lot, and I know the members are really going to appreciate having this resource in the webinar library. So we just cannot thank you enough. It's been a wonderful talk, and I hope everyone has some hope after watching this, that, you know, there are many things that you can do, whether you go the management route or you decide to do testing. There's a lot of options, but I think the biggest thing I've learned is don't be afraid to get your vet involved, and you know, don't try to tackle this alone, or certainly let the horse suffer through this for years and years. Do you have any final thoughts, Dr. White?
No, I think that, well, yes, one final thought. Remember a couple of things. One, we all hope that ASIT is the magic bullet, but in most cases, there isn't one. Two, this is a lifelong problem. And three, the best management you can do, the better off your horse is going to be. And that you have to work with an interested veterinarian and realize that often it takes time to figure out the solution for your particular horse.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you who have tuned in tonight in the audience. And again, this webinar will be recorded, and will be available on the Fauna website. You can find this webinar and any of our other webinars by simply going to the Fauna homepage, www.fauna.com, and look for the webinar tab right on the homepage. So thank you, Dr. White, and to everyone else out there, we'll see you around for the next webinar.
Okay. Good evening, everybody.